Hi, everyone. I'm John Bonifaz. I'm the president of Free Speech for People, and I'm honored to be here today with Bruce Fein. I'd like to introduce Bruce, and then we're going to have a conversation about impeachment. Bruce Fein is an American lawyer who specializes in constitutional and international law. Mr. Fein has written numerous articles on constitutional issues for the Washington Times, Slate.com, the New York Times, the Huffington Post, and Legal Times, and is active on civil liberties issues. He has worked for the American Enterprise Institute and the Heritage Foundation, both conservative think tanks. He is a graduate of Harvard Law School. After graduating, Mr. Fein joined the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel just when the Watergate scandal was starting. His first task was drafting a 100-page memorandum on what constituted an impeachable offense. Mr. Fein served as a top Justice Department official during the President Reagan administration. In 1981, 1982, he served as Associate Deputy Attorney General in the U.S. Department of Justice and supervised the department's litigation and vetting of candidates for the federal judiciary. He has many published works, including most recently the books American Empire Before the Fall and Constitutional Peril, the Life and Death Struggle for Our Constitution and Democracy. Bruce, thanks very much for joining this
Well,
discussion.
thanks. Thank you for inviting me.
So first, I'd like to ask you to start out and explain what you see as the purpose of the impeachment clause in the Constitution. Why did the framers place it there?
It's there, as Ben Franklin explained at the convention, as a substitute for tyrannicide. Earlier, you had Caesar had its Brutus, Charles the First had his Cromwell. Those were rather bloody revolutions. So the impeachment clause was to remove a president in a civilized manner, according to due process, for someone who was no longer a trustworthy steward of our liberties and following the Constitution. That was the clear purpose. George Mason explained as well at the Constitutional Convention was that attempts to subvert the Constitution would justify impeachment. Now, impeachment was also understood to be a rational, moderate way to dispense of a ruler who was a threat to our liberties. It was not the guillotine in the French Revolution. That's oftentimes portrayed today as what impeachment is. It simply means that you're removed from office. There are no further penalties. It may well be that if you've committed a crime, you could be subject to criminal prosecution like any other citizen of the United States. But it's a very measured and tempered way in which we can remove presidents who were thought to be the most dangerous to our liberties. And of course, that was all of history had shown the framers that of all the officials who are likely to encroach on our liberties, the president, the executive, is the greatest threat. There weren't histories of persons serving in parliament or persons serving the legislative branch or the judicial branch of having this ambition to reduce us all to what the Declaration of Independence say would be mere minions. That was the focus. And I want to underscore, John, it wasn't to be a revolution. It wasn't to be arbitrary or capricious. In a impeachment proceeding, the president has a right to an attorney. He has a right to cross-examine evidence. It's a full-blown, fair process. And it takes a 2/3 majority in the Senate and not as much to have a criminal conviction, which is unanimity. The Chief Justice of the United States presides. And I go to this extent to just try to underscore it is not an upheaval in the American political system. Remember as well, for the listeners or the viewers, if the president is removed under the Constitution, the vice president, which is his running mate, takes office. It doesn't shift party control. So if the incumbent is a Republican would take office. If a Democrat is in control, a Democrat would take office, because the president and vice president these days are always of the same party. Anyway, that's try to eliminate this fear of alarm and this is like a total upheaval. It's not. It can be done in a very, very measured way. In fact, I was there, John, every day when we had the Gerald Ford replace Richard Nixon. Now, Nixon wasn't technically impeached because he resigned, but he was going to be impeached. Their transition went. There was no revolution, no blood in the streets, and no storming of the Bastille. Mr. Nixon left office. Gerald Ford became president. We moved on.
And on the high crimes and misdemeanors point, we hear often people asking, well, show us the criminal conviction that has occurred. Can you address the point as to what high crimes means in the context of impeachment?
Yes. High crimes and misdemeanors was a phrase that was borrowed from the British experience, where they also had impeachment for high crimes and misdemeanors. It means, as Alexander Hamilton explained in, I believe, his Federal 65, that it was political crimes, that is, crimes against the Constitution, against the form of government, if you will. And that's what George Mason meant when he said attempts to subvert the Constitution. And that's why the removal, if you believe that there was a criminal standard, John, why is the punishment just lose long office? If it was a crime, you'd figure that someone would go to prison. And if it's a crime, you'd have to have proof beyond a reasonable doubt, all the other safeguards that we recognize that accompany criminal prosecutions, Miranda rights, other cross-examination, that kind of thing. It's not that level. And so it's thought to be a crime against the system, if you will, a crime against the Constitution, the processes by which we have self-government and checks and balances. And that's why, because you have a lower threshold, because there's a lower sanction. Obviously, the threshold of wrongdoing is higher, if you can get the death penalty. That's the most severe. But all you have in this case is you just lose your job. It's like a CEO getting fired by the board of directors. That doesn't mean that we tolerate arbitrary and capricious standard, but we're not so worried about getting it wrong because someone's not losing their life, right? Just means they go back and, like President Nixon did, served out in San Clemente and had a relatively peaceful life afterwards.
Great. And you authored a letter, co-authored it with Ralph Nader and Lou Fisher that you sent to President Trump on April 30th. Can you talk about that letter and what you said?
Yes, certainly, John. The letter begins by noting that our ask, which was that Mr. Trump resign, was not unprecedented, because that's exactly what President Richard Nixon did on August 9th, 1974. He resigned because I think he understood he had committed impeachable offenses, wrongdoing related to the Watergate cover-up, as well as refusing to comply with the subpoena for documents that had led the House Judiciary Committee already to vote articles of impeachment. So rather than push the country through the ordeal of a trial, which he knew he was going to lose, he had been told by the Republican leadership he's going to lose, he resigned. So we're asking Trump to do something that had been done before. And we also believe that compared to the 3 articles of impeachment voted against Richard Nixon, Mr. Trump's were of a different scale, a magnitude far, far greater. And to illustrate, at least in terms of the attitude in his frame of mind, which I think shows that he's a clear and present danger to our liberties, we could quote his own famous or infamous statement, July 23rd, in 2019, quote, "Then I have Article 2, where I have the right to do anything I want as president." And we know that in the interim period, 6 years since then, 2025, he hasn't learned anything, because he said just recently he isn't certain that he actually has to uphold the Constitution, that his oath may be just optional advisory, which to my mind is frightening. I mean, really? Because John, that uniquely the president is told in the constitutional text itself exactly what words he has to take an oath to in order to assume office. And some of those words are to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. And we have President Trump says, well, maybe it's advisory. That's not binding on him. Okay. So that gives you, and the reason why this is important is when you're trying to identify circumstances where there's a need for preemptive action, you don't race off the cliff before you don't permit you race off the cliff. You stop racing before you get to that edge. That it's important to understand what the frame of mind of Donald Trump is to know what's likely to happen, given what we know his ambition is. And it's clearly stated his ambition is to become a king. Oftentimes, he has himself displayed on the internet with a crown on his head. And not only crown, now he's also presented himself as being the new pope. So there are really no limits on what his ambition for power is, which is exactly the kind of Caesar or Charles I that the framers feared and provided impeachment power accordingly.
Yes. And so you have a number of articles of impeachment, 22
Yeah.
different impeachable offenses you cite in this letter to President Trump on April 30th. Can you uh, talk through some of them and why you see them as impeachable offenses?
Yes. Thank you. Well, one of the most important, and if we haven't quite come, well, I guess we've come there with the Houthis, is the war power. The framers were unanimous. We can never let presidents be endowed with authority to start war because the incentive to concoct excuses is so great because wartime, all the power gravitates to the executive, that only Congress can declare war. We already have under President Trump. We woke up one day and say, hey, we're at war with the Houthis. Where did that come from? Now, the greater scandal that the media played it was, well, why were you talking on Signal about what the tax take? Congress has never declared war against the Houthis. So where's the president get this authority to drop bombs? Not only is dropping bombs purportedly on the Houthis, but he's killing many civilians and migrants as well, which probably are war crimes because it suggests we're using force vastly disproportionate to any military objective. I don't even know whether we have a military objective in attacking the Houthis. It's just attacking for the sake of attacking. And maybe Israel wants us to do it because the Houthis are kind of aligned with Iran and Israel doesn't like Iran. But the point is that this is a clear statement of war power that does not belong to the president. Now, it's complemented with his statements that he can, in his view, go and attack and reclaim the Panama Canal by force on his own. He can do the same in Greenland on his own. He said he can annex Canada on their own, even though he said I might not have to do it. But he said just recently to the Canadian new prime minister that he really doesn't have to get any authority. He may go ahead and annex Canada by force. Clear statements that he says that he has the war power, which he doesn't. Now, when you have those claims made repeatedly, this is not just one slip of the tongue, and they're not retracted ever, and there's plenty of time to retract them. No, we cannot afford having any president claim the war power. It's the destruction of every republic in the history of the world. Now, a rebuttal can be, John, well, other presidents have done that as well. Harry Truman usurped the war power. He said our Korean War was a police action. Well, that's true. And it means that in some sense, to impeach him for the war power violations is singling him out. Well, I've been arguing for impeaching presidents for war power violations for about 40 years. But you have to stop someplace. And though it would be, in some sense, and I apologize, let me just pause a second. In one phase in the Nixon investigation impeachment, there was consideration of impeaching him for an illegal war against Cambodia that he had conducted secretly. They decided to take it out in part because other Democratic presidents had undertaken wars, including Lyndon Johnson, without proper authorization. That it would be turned against the Democratic Party. I don't really care about any party, so it didn't bother me. But that had been contemplated, but was thrown out. So it would be true that this is the first time in at least since Harry Truman where a president had been held accountable for asserting the war power that's entrusted to Congress. But you got to start someplace. I would concede there's an element of unfairness, but well, otherwise it's like saying if a murderer commits 100 murders and gets away with them all on the 101st murder, you should let it go by because, well, all these other murders happened and no one was prosecuted. No, there is an element of singling out, but it's better than not having some justice. I'd say is better than no justice at all. So that's a very important point with regard to the usurping the war power. Now, I would say that then the second category of impeachable offenses, John, are simply the failure. He has an obligation under Article 2 to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Again, that has a British heritage to it. King James II was removed by the Parliament, and the English Bill of Rights of 1689 declared specifically a king cannot refuse, decline to enforce a law without the consent of the Parliament, right? So this was to make certain that a president who refuses to enforce a law is de facto voiding the law. He's just saying, okay, it's not really a law because I'm not going to enforce it. We saw that in part when President Trump ordered that the charges brought by his Justice Department against Eric Adams, the New York mayor, was going to be dropped. Not because there wasn't evidence. In fact, he went out of his way. Yeah, there's plenty of evidence of guilt, but we kind of like his assistance on immigration. That's not a trade-off that a president gets to take. He has to faithfully execute the laws. And in the administration of Mr. Trump, since his new inauguration, he notoriously, in the very first day, he stated, and he's continuing to state, I'm not going to enforce the law against TikTok that both requires some kind of divestiture that's satisfactory. He says, first he said, I'm going to defer it for 75 days. Then he said, I'm going to defer it for more days. Then he said, yeah, I kind of like TikTok, so I just don't think I'll enforce the law. He can't do that. He can't just decide I don't like the law. You can go back and ask Congress to amend the law, which is quite proper, but you can't do that on your own. You're violating your oath of office. I mean, another example of his refusal to execute the law concerns is he stood up and said, well, we're not going to enforce the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act anymore because I think it's unfair. Well, then why don't you ask Congress to repeal it or amend it? That's how this system works. You say that you won the biggest mandate ever in history, then use it. You have a Republican majority in the House and the Senate. Process is everything. You can, and the reason the listeners need to know, once you tell a president, well, you can get away with it, Mr. Trump, and there's no stopping point at that point. There's no fire line that says, well, you can't then stop enforcing any law that you want to. And that's what I would call Justice Jackson's characterization of setting a precedent that lies around like a loaded weapon, ready to be used by any future incumbent. And the other comes and says, well, okay, I don't like this law. I won't enforce that law. I don't like the entire Title VIII of U.S. Code. I mean, under that theory, there's nothing wrong if Mr. Trump was criticizing President Biden for not enforcing immigration laws. Well, why couldn't he just say, I don't like the immigration laws, anybody can come in? The same way that Trump says, I don't like certain laws, I simply won't enforce them. Well, if you use them against Eric Adams, I won't enforce, the laws against fraud and bribery, et cetera, and things of that sort. And this has become, overwhelmingly the pattern of Mr. Trump. Then we have other efforts where where I would say in a different way, he's not enforcing the law. He's just dismantling agencies that Congress created by statute. He can't just decide, oh, I don't like the education department and shut it down de facto by saying, okay, I won't spend any money. I'll tell all the employees to go home like he's done with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, because that's the equivalent of defeating the whole purpose of Congress creating these agencies. He can go to Congress and say, please repeal these statutes. That's quite acceptable. There have been occasions when agencies were ended by Congress. I know in my lifetime, the Interstate Commerce Commission, the Civil Aeronautics Board, Congress said, okay, we'll just repeal them. And when President Reagan, he went to Congress, said you should repeal the statute. So there are ways to do this. That's the legal way. You don't do things illegally. Again, because you're enabling someone to pick and choose what laws to obey. Everybody's going to have different ones. And then you have nothing but the law of the jungle. Then we have another major law that he's violating is the Impoundment Control Act of 1974. Again, the president continues to say he's not going to spend vast amounts of money that Congress has appropriated, whether it's funded VOA, USAID, student loans, or otherwise. Well, the Impoundment Control Act says if you want to withhold spending or rescind spending that Congress has appropriated, you have to present what you want to rescind to Congress. They have 45 days. They will give you an up or down vote. And if they approve it, then you don't have to spend it. But if they don't, then you have to spend it. As simple as that. I mean, it's very, very important to honor the Impoundment Control Act, as James Madison explained, during in the Federalist Papers, that it's the power of the purse that he says, the trump card, if you will, that the Congress has over the executive branch, because they control the money. And if you don't have any money, it's pretty hard to operate whatsoever. And so the Impoundment Control Act is very, very critical to fortifying that power of the purse of Congress. And the president just has, as anybody knows who's read a newspaper or watched television in the last 3 months, knows president just decided, no, I don't want to spend anything here. We got grants there, got grants to Harvard, freeze funds there. And again, all wrongful. There are ways to do this. And when even you had conservatives like Rand Paul say, hey, why don't you just present to us $500 billion in rescissions we can vote on? That no. I think the reason why, even with a Republican majority, John, that president is resisting asking Congress to do anything, because he wants to set precedents that say, I don't need Congress. I can rule by executive order. Compare Franklin Roosevelt, who came in 1932 on a much bigger mandate than Trump in 2024. In the first 100 days, John, he got 100 statutes that Congress passed that brought in the New Deal. Statutes. Trump, he doesn't even ask for statutes, right? Just says that, issue executive order here, the executive order there, executive order day. I don't even know what he's signing, whether he understands whether he's signing. That's not the way you do it. And of course, in part, this is the irony, is that the so-called conservatives who say, well, you have to pay scrupulous and focus on the language and text of the Constitution, which I agree with. You know what? The Constitution nowhere mentions executive orders. Zero. So you're making this up. It does mention statutes and legislation, executive orders. Where does that come from? You just made it up. No, this is the called the living, breathing Constitution that grows trees and that so-called conservatives supposed to derive. But you're doing the same thing with these so-called executive orders. But anyway, go back to the impeachable offenses. So these are, in terms of genre, he's simply not executing the laws that Congress has enacted. Some cases on the criminal side, he says, I just don't like them. Others, Congress has created agencies he doesn't like. Now he stated also that he is going to refuse to enforce regulations that are on the books, even before they're repealed. So I'm just going to say, hey, the regulations are there. They have the same dignity as statutes, but you know what? It's going to take too long to do a legal review and repeal. So I just won't. This thousands of them. Again, failing to faithfully execute the laws. And then we have situations where he clearly goes beyond, I think, any rational interpretation of precedents and the law. For example, one of his first executive orders was to repeal birthright citizenship in Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. You can't do that. You can't. An executive order can't override the Constitution, no matter how big your electoral mandate is. The Constitution is there that people oftentimes refuse to remind themselves because there is a belief that certain provisions are so important they should not be subject to the outcome of any election. Even a Franklin Roosevelt election in 1936, winning 46 out of 48 states and 60% of the popular vote and virtually all of the electoral votes, that they are fundamental to our existence as human beings, and no majority can take away those unalienable rights. So Mr. Trump here says, well, I'll just issue an executive order and take away the right of birthright citizenship. He can't do that. The fact is that in the Declaration of Independence, one of the prime grievances against King George III was he's blocking immigration. We wanted more immigration. That was a grievance. And if you look at the text of the Constitution itself, in enumerating congressional powers, Congress is authorized to regulate naturalization, but not immigration. It says nothing about blocking immigrants. It states something about granting them citizenship, which is different than being here legally. And prior to President Trump, there were various legislative initiatives to try to tamper with birthright citizenship I thought were problematic. And all of them, by both Democratic and Republican administrations in the White House, said you can't do this by statute. You need a constitutional amendment. And I want to underscore as much as I can, John, the Constitution doesn't place limits on what you can accomplish. It sets the rules, the ground rules of how you can do it. Birthright citizenship can be repealed. The Prohibition Amendment was repealed. So we have an example of an amendment being repealed. But you have to then go through the process. You have to convince people. You have a process of deliberation. It's open. You can consider pros and cons, and then you vote. I mean, that's what self-government is about.
And
The
you do it via the
deliberative process.
constitutional amendment process
Yeah,
too.
the amendment
Yeah,
process is about.
yeah,
And it's the same way when if you don't like the statutes on immigration, then you get a new statute. I mean, another one, say when we talk about failing to faithfully execute the laws, is this really, I believe, absurd argument that's being made that the alien that as we speak, John, Venezuela has invaded the United States. We're engaged in a war with Venezuela, which, by the way, if it were true, 31 NATO countries would be sending soldiers to the United States to defend us from an attack against Venezuela under Section 5 of the NATO treaty. We haven't seen any of that, right? Because no one believes it. No, it's absurd. But he makes the statement, hey, we're being invaded by Venezuela. And the reason why he makes up this derangement is because under the Alien Enemies Act, you don't need due process. You don't need hearings before you remove people. But of course, you have to make sure that they're aliens. But it says specifically in wartime you can do these.
right,
We're not in wartime. No one believes that. So
right.
this is another example, flagrant violation of his duty to faithfully execute the laws. Moreover, part of that duty, John, includes enforcing judgments of federal courts.
Yes.
We found it most graphically in 1957 when President Eisenhower, despite only mild agreement with the desegregation decree of Brown against the board, sent the U.S. Army to escort 9 brave Little Rock High School black students desegregate Central High. He sent the Army to enforce the federal court judgment. Right? Now we have a judgment out of the U.S. Supreme Court, unanimous, including 3 Trump appointees, saying he must facilitate the return of a resident, of an alien who was protected from deportation by who? The Trump administration in 2019 from El Salvador dungeon. And Trump first says, well, I can't do it. I'm hopeless. I can change Panama, I can annex Canada, I can overthrow Greenland, but El Salvador is too big. So no, everybody knew that was a joke. His attorneys walk into court and have the audacity to say, no, we can't do anything. Even though we are the one who are paying El Salvador to detain this. His name is Abrego Garcia, an alleged Venezuelan gang member, but there's no evidence of gang membership. So this is another example of, say, just stigmatizing people without evidence. But then Mr. Trump the other day said, yeah, I can pick up the phone and call the president of El Salvador, Bukele, who was recently in the Oval Office. Yeah, he'd do what I asked him to do. But I don't like the guy, meaning Abrego Garcia. So here he's openly stating, even though I have an obligation to facilitate the return of Abrego Garcia, I'm not going to do it. That's a flagrant violation of his obligation to faithfully execute the laws, including court judgments. So, I mean, then let's go to another category, John. And this is his abuse of, clear violations of the First Amendment right to free speech and association. We know as lawyers, we associate and we pick and choose cases. Oftentimes they're combined just a regular garden variety case, but they have overriding philosophical implications as well, depending upon the claims that we're making. And Mr. Trump, by executive order, decided he was just going to excommunicate major law firms. I just don't like you. You represented Hillary Clinton. You represented Democrats. You represented somebody that I don't like. Or you had somebody in your office, in your law firm that worked for Robert Mueller who investigated me. So no, then where I'm telling that your firm can't get on federal property. We're going to strip you of your security clearances, which mean you can't take a lot of cases. All of you, none of your employees can ever work for the federal government. You're basically saying that you're going to be cut off from what we know as lawyers are the customary access you need to the federal government if you're going to litigate on behalf of a client. And he did this without any proof that they had done anything wrong, that anything was unprofessional. He makes it up. He says, well, you operated in a way that's very, very unfair and doesn't satisfy legal standards. Well, we know, John, that there's Rule 11 in our practice that says If you have an attorney that's misbehaved, you can ask for sanctions against them. Trump has never asked, well, where are the sanctions? If you think that there is overreaching, you can make bar complaints, you can ask for sanctions. He never does this. So he just lives in his own simple world, and I'm just condemning you in my own mind as being unfair against me. But we already have courts saying that this is flagrantly unconstitutional, and I'm sure they will be affirmed in the U.S. Supreme Court if it gets that high. But here's an effort where Trump is trying to silence his opponents by using the federal government against them. It's a great irony because here's a classic example of weaponizing the federal government against his opponents. And he says that's what he's all against. Really? You're practicing. Then we have other elements of free speech violation when it's clear he's trying to revoke the visas and permanent residency status of individuals for speaking their views about Israel's attack and occupation of Gaza. You can agree or disagree. It's not because they did anything that was disruptive, they committed any crime, did any sit-in, obstructed thoroughfares or classrooms, nothing. They just wrote or spoke against what they view as, and many others share that view, war crimes, wrongful acts of Israel, not only in Palestine in the current war, but historically denying Palestinians the right of self-determination, a right that we proclaim in the Declaration of Independence as self-evident. And this is something that enriches the United States. Nothing is more American than peaceful dissent. Nothing is more American, if you might call, than civil disobedience. Goes back as far as Thoreau and Martin Luther King. So there's nothing un-American about this. They all working within the process, not violating any laws. And Mr. Trump, directing the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, is trying to deport these people, strip them of their right to remain here for exercising free speech. And one of the things I believe is often forgotten, it's not just free speech of the individuals. We, you and me, we benefit. We have a right to receive information. That's part of free speech too, the listener as well as the speaker. And we're more impoverished in the richness of the ideas that we approach and can evaluate on their merits if somebody's shut up in silence. We'd like to hear your view. It doesn't mean we agree with it, but John Stuart Mill was the great celebrant of all ideas being open and argued because it sharpens your own mind. You understand why you agree or disagree. And no matter some things you may think is really off the wall, but if you have to think through why do I disagree with that, is what hones your critical thinking. So these are what I view as flagrant violations of the First Amendment. Then let me get to a couple of other provisions that are more off the beaten path. These are, we have the domestic and foreign emoluments clauses. These are clauses in the Constitution that say we do not want the president to be, his loyalty to be pulled because he's getting presents or favors, from either domestic or foreign constituents who add or augment, the salary that we're going to pay him while he's president of the United States, right? And Mr. Trump, and this is on the domestic side of emoluments clause, he's running his own businesses, either directly or indirectly through his family. And so there's no Chinese wall between Donald Trump and Eric Trump and Donald Jr. or whatever. They're running businesses, golf courses, hotels, and everybody knows the way Trump is. If you patronize his hotel, you pay $1,000, $1,500, $2,000 a night. You go to his golf courses and pay this or that. He looks and sees exactly what's going on with regard to people who are showering him with money and who are not, and he acts accordingly. This is clearly, in my judgment, a violation of the emoluments clauses. You are using your position as president of the United States to encourage or funnel domestic as well as foreigners to patronize your business to make you richer, and you will then have your decisions altered accordingly. It's no mistake in my mind, to understand that Mr. Trump is very, very friendly to Saudi Arabia, among other countries in the Middle East, including shutting his eyes to the fact that Saudi Arabia murdered, assassinated an American journalist, Jamal Khashoggi, because he getting money from them. They're just nice people. Even though he claims that he's a wonderful Christian or whatever, in Saudi Arabia you can't wear a crucifix. That's viewed as being contrary to Islam. or at least to their version of us. So those violations of the domestic and the foreign emoluments clauses are additional reasons, that we can't trust Mr. Trump. So that's kind of the broad scope.
Yes.
You can break them down to individual cases. And the last category I'd utilize, John, is that we have a president who simply refuses, to comply with subpoenas, no information, no. He runs secret government. He's trying to conceal, what Elon Musk is doing with DOJ, the Department of Government Efficiency, which is a misnomer if there ever was one. And the whole idea of government by the consent of the government requires transparency. How can you consent to the government doing things if you don't even know what the government is doing? So he stiff arms. It's harder to pin President Trump the second term on this because Congress doesn't ask for any information anymore. Basically, they've shut down, and therefore Trump knows that he doesn't have to hand over everything. I think it was Public Citizen. Maybe it was your group, John. They filed the freedom, insisting that the Department of Government Efficiency is subject to the Freedom of Information Act, which is now we have to basically play the oversight role that Congress should be playing. And of course, Trump is trying to resist that. He may or may not succeed. So, I mean, as a second tier, maybe it's wrongful to put a second tier. We know how many violations of the right to privacy is already undertaken. Going in, Social Security information, we have the Right to Privacy Act, to make sure that information about us is not shared with other agencies unless there's a, good cause. And Mr. Musk and his Trumpeteers come in, or Musketeers, and who knows what they're doing. I mean, that's in some sense a danger because it's not transparent. Who knows what these guys are doing with it? They're 19-year-olds. They don't know anything. Yes. I mean, it's frightening. And they don't, not only do they not know anything in terms of a moderation and judgment, but they don't know how government operates. They don't have any clue what statutes are. You tell them the Privacy Act, they shrug their shoulders. There's no privacy in it. So anyway, that's kind of a
thank you
panorama of what we put in that letter.
Excellent. Thank you for that rundown. Based on everything you just explained, and based on your historic knowledge, having come into the Justice Department at the time of the Watergate scandal, for those who are maybe newer to the subject of the Watergate scandal, how would you compare everything you're seeing now with Donald Trump and this administration versus what Richard Nixon was forced to resign for and would have been impeached for?
Well, this is orders of magnitude worse. The articles of impeachment voted against Mr. Nixon, obstruction of justice, which is bad enough, and abusing federal, might call weaponization of the agencies, to go after he had a very famous or infamous enemies list, although it really wasn't. At that time, John, you boasted if you got on his enemies list. I mean, Walter Cronkite and his stars. That was kind of a badge of honor. But I never had the sense at that time, living through it, that Nixon would just set the Constitution ablaze. There were violations, but you never had President Nixon saying, well, I don't really have to honor the Constitution, respect it if I don't want to. I can go into the Panama Canal and all these other places. I don't need any authorization, to initiate war. And it's as bad as Nixon was in many respects, he wasn't using it as his office, to enrich himself, running sideline businesses, being a pitch man for Bibi Rebozo. Bibi Rebozo, for those who aren't as old as us or me, anyway, he was kind of like the Elon Musk for Donald Trump. So this is orders of magnitude more worrisome. And it also is aggravated in its seriousness, John, because at least at that time, Congress still had at least a semi-backbone. You had people who would be willing to tell Mr. You need to go. They issued subpoenas. I mean, the effort to impeach was a bipartisan effort. The Republicans understood that the system was in jeopardy if Mr. Nixon could get away with what he could get away with. And you don't have that anymore. You just have Congress sitting there as an idle spectator, watching Elon Musk dismantle everything that their handiwork and shrugging their shoulders and saying, well, at least he's doing it. We'd like to do it, but we don't want to vote on it. So That's what makes and the reason why that observation is important. It underscores to our audience, Sean, the criticality of citizen involvement. We are the last guardrails. Congress will act as a guardrail only if we shout and scream. You must do that or you're not going to be in office. Now, that did happen in Watergate when there were at least initial indications by President Nixon that he was not going to surrender the tapes, which were critical to his incrimination and ouster. There were 30,000 telegrams came into Congress every day, all offices combined. You're not seeing that right now, which is very, very troublesome. But if they did see it, they would act. If they have to choose between their skin and Mr. Trump's, they're going to choose themselves. And it's up to us to make them see they are going to have to choose one or the other.
Yes. And that segues very well into the next question for you, which is, we hear, I know you hear this too, this argument being made. Well, Donald Trump's already been impeached twice. He wasn't convicted by the Senate on either occasion, and there's no point in doing this again. We need to move on. There's no way the votes are there in the Congress to impeach and remove him. So this is all a waste of time. We should move on and not even talk about impeachment. How do you respond to all that?
Well, I respond in part, John. It's a wonderful question to show that history discredits that kind of theorizing. When the initial Watergate hearings began on President Nixon, this is in 1973 when the hearings opened, it's the same refrains I heard as you just uttered now. It's never going to happen. And at that time, of course, we hadn't impeached a president in 100 years since 1868, right? That's never, never, never going to happen. Most people didn't even know what impeachment was. That's why I had to be assigned to look at the impeachment clause because it was in Deathwood Toad for a century. But as the evidence came out and the American people had digested the evidence and it was fairly done, where there's opportunities on both sides have their case, public opinion turned against the president, aided by court decisions. And at the end, I mean, he had fallen to less than almost single digits in popularity. So that may be the case now, but you have to start at some point. Who knows, what evidence, will come out and what will be persuasive. We know the reason why so much is secret and not transparent is because it's probably going to be ugly if we actually saw everything that DOJ was doing or President Trump and could change public opinion. So the reason why you start is education has to start someplace, and it did in Watergate. And the other element that comes into play is that I believe the brazenness of Mr. Trump is far greater this second term than the first term. I mean, it's truly astonishing to me that a president would not feel embarrassed to say, I'm not sure that I have to obey my oath of office. Could you imagine George Washington saying that? I mean, to lawyers, it's just unfathomable. Well, do other officers not have to obey their oath of office either? Now we're back to the law of the jungle and we pick up AK-47s. I mean, really? You're the president of the United States. So that's why I think this time around, there's a greater chance that the educational component will ripen into something that's actually done. And it may well be that it have impact too on the 2026 elections. Not a partisan issue, but it's an educational issue. I mean, I've stated that if I was running the elections, I would want 2026 to be one question and one question alone to the American people. Do you want to keep the Constitution or not? Nothing else. That should be the one issue. You vote on that, nothing else. Because without the Constitution, we're flying apart. That was the unifying force that created the country. And if we can't agree on the Constitution, then all it is political power. It's how Thucydides described power at the time of the Peloponnesian War. The strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must. And that's a formula for injustice.
Yes. And a corollary to my last question is the idea that some have advanced. Well, we really need to turn to the courts, and the courts can save us here. And we need to litigate all these matters. And I know you fully agree that it's important to go to court when possible to litigate matters, but can you address that vis-a-vis the impeachment question?
Of course, John, a wonderful question. First of all, if you could go to the courts, you wouldn't write the impeachment clause the way they did, which is, you only have the House and the Senate, and it's clear. And the U.S. Supreme Court has said we don't get involved in impeachment issues, right? So why would you rely on the courts when the impeachment clause says no? We rely on our elected legislators. Secondly, the courts are deficient in two ways. One, as you well know, John, there are many critical constitutional issues like the war power that never get litigated in court because of lacking standing, political question doctrine, or whatever. Very important constitutional question. Indeed, the war power has never been decided by the Supreme Court in 235 years because you can't get standing. Okay. So some of the most egregious violations will not be subject to judicial review. Secondly, that even if you do have a final ruling of a court, it does not have a military, it has not armed forces, it doesn't have the power of the purse. Ultimately, it depends upon the executive branch voluntarily complying with its orders. Suppose Mr. Trump, and he's already flirted with the idea, says, so what? I'm not going to comply with the order. If there's not impeachment, courts can't do anything on their own. Even if they issued fines, they held in contempt. Contempt's just a piece of paper. Nothing's going to happen unless you get a federal marshal to enforce it. And that's why you have to be focused on Congress.
So impeachment is the remedy for addressing the crisis we face today.
Yes. And I also would add this, John. People also say, well, once you go down that route, we'll be like third party dictator. We'll have like musical chairs in the White House. Everybody will be there and be impeached. Wrong. You get one impeachment removal, it will not happen, at least for another 200 years. People in the White House like to stay there because it has the power. They're not going to risk impeachment and leave, So the reason why the abuses persist is because we haven't actually removed a president for impeachable offenses. But once it happens once, we won't have to worry about it for a long time, if ever.
Thank you, Bruce Fein. Thank you for your leadership and your courage. And thank you for standing up for our Constitution.
Thank you, John. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely.